Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. The Abhidhamma considers consciousness or citta in its functional capacity as occurring momentarily, associated with various mental states and taking specific objects. In the Abhidhamma, the consciousness is analyzed, or the category of citta is analyzed into 89 types or modes of momentary occurrence. And it's a quite complicated system. The divisions of the different kinds of citta are several, but there are two that are most important that cover most of the bases. One is in terms of division between functional and resultant and effective. That is, looking at the role of the moment of consciousness in terms of the aspect of karma making and karma resultant. Karma making, or effective citta, occurs when the mind makes a decision, a moment of will, a branch point where the being decides to go down path A or path B. At that moment, a decision is made, and then either path will have some results in the future. The resultant moment of consciousness is one in which the being at that moment has no control, no choice. It's just a result of past causes, and it's what's presented to consciousness. And the third category, kriya, or say functional consciousness, is classed as neither karma making or karma receiving. It's sort of the housekeeping functions of the mind processing information. In terms of the first category, functional or karma making, this is also subdivided into kusala and akusala, skillful or unskillful. These are the terms used in the Buddhist texts to classify the quality of karma. Karma meaning action. It's actually action in the mind or decision. I think this is significant. It puts a whole different flavor on it. The terms of good and evil are not used very much. The texts more often talk about karma as being skillful or unskillful. Skillful are those actions, those decisions, those branch points, the path chosen at the branch point, that will lead to less suffering for oneself and others, that alleviate suffering in the world. And the highest action are those which lead to transcendence of the world. This is the karma that leads beyond karma. So these are all acts of kindness, of generosity, of acts imbued with compassion or loving kindness. These are kusala. The other type is akusala, is unskillful. These are actions which lead to increased suffering for oneself or others. So acts of selfishness, of cruelty, acts motivated by anger, ill will, greed, these are akusala, unskillful. So this use of the terminology skillful and unskillful makes the understanding of living one's life as a skill, a craft, or perhaps as a game that can be played skillfully or unskillfully. In terms of the analogy for a game, there was an ancient Indian game called Leela that was the origin of the modern simplified version that we know as Snakes and Ladders, which is a game played by children to teach them little simple moral lessons. You know, if you do something good, you go up the ladder. If you do something bad, you go down the snake. There was a somewhat more complex version in India that was based on the same principle to teach the rudiments of karma and result. The resultant chittas are those mind moments which occur automatically as a result of past causes. There's a principle in Abhidhamma: nothing arises without a cause, and nothing arises from a single cause. So there's no randomness, but it's also a mistake or a simplification to think of anything as being monocausal. It's not just one cause for any event. It's a whole matrix, a complex of things that have happened and conditions that have been set that result in this occurrence. And one of the major causes for any resultant moment is past karma, past effective moments, skillful or unskillful. So we can divide resultant karma in different ways, resultant chittas in different ways. One is to divide them between what's called profitable and unprofitable. That's the analog of skillful and unskillful. A skillful action leads to a profitable result, and an unskillful action leads to an unprofitable result. You could also think of these as pleasant and painful. Another way of dividing these resultant chittas is by sense base. They occur in either the eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, or mind. Mental, purely mental event. One implication that's worth contemplating in this aspect is that any sense impression that we have, anything we see, hear, taste, touch, so on, is a karma resultant. So the world we experience is, in a very important sense, built by our past karma. But as I said, the causation for any particular event is multiple. So if you take an example of a pleasant result, and let's say you see a beautiful sunset, and you feel pleasant, it feels happiness in the mind. The cause of the sunset is really nothing directly to do with your karma. It's a movement of the earth and conditions in the atmosphere that cause the phenomenon that we call a sunset. But the occurrence of that in your consciousness stream is in part a result of your past karma, that you've made some good karma, that you're able to see this sunset. Even the fact that you have functional eyes to see with is a result of karma. The fact that you're a human being is a result of karma. And this is the most powerful effect of karma, is determining the nature and station of your particular birth. Then you have a period of time. For a human being, it's a few decades to experience that form and its capacities and its limitations. This is the form that you have acquired by your past karma. Upon the moment of death, in the majority of cases where the person is not an arahant, that's a different story, but if the person is, the vast majority of cases, the person's not an arahant, then at the moment of death, they still have karma and desire, at least the desire for becoming, still present in the mind. So those causes do not go unfulfilled. It's like a debt that's owed the universe. Consciousness arises again in the next moment somewhere else. And the fact that consciousness arises in a new being, in a new continuum, in the human case, in the fertilized egg in the womb of a woman, then that also has prior causes. There must have been a previous moment to condition that moment. So the particular station, place of rebirth is determined by the past karma. And one can be born a human, and various different modalities within the human sphere. There's two genders and various nationalities and differences of degrees of intelligence and of strength and of health and so on. And all these factors come from your past karma. Or you can be reborn lower if you've made a lot of akusala karma. You could be reborn as an animal or a ghost or a hell being. And all these states are states of greater suffering. Or one can be born higher if one has made a lot of kusala karma. One can be reborn into the Deva or Brahma realms. The particular combination of karma that leads to a Deva rebirth is good ethics plus generosity. And the karma that leads to rebirth in the Brahma world is the development of meditation and the experience of jhana. So arising in any of these different realms is not chance, it's determined by past karma. At least as far as the Deva realms go, the creation of the existence by the force of karma is quite direct and explicit. The mansion or the vamana that a Deva arises in appears by the force of the person's karma even before their death. So it's waiting for them. It's like their karma is building a palace in heaven. So we have this principal division of consciousness between effective, resultant, and what's called functional. We don't need to say much about that. That's those moments of consciousness that occur as intermediary steps in the cognitive series. They just have a purely functional role in processing information and passing it on to the next stage. But the other two are quite important, and they're again subdivided by this ethical division between skillful and unskillful and the equivalent results. So again, to return to the analogy of playing a game, if you think of playing a game of cards, something like bridge or poker that has an element of skill involved, the cards that you're dealt is like your resultant. At that moment, you don't have any effect over it. You're just receiving dealt cards. But then how you play them, what you do with them, is your effective, your karma making. The analogy is not perfect because if it was, how skillfully you played your hand would affect your subsequent hands. You'd get better hands dealt to you. But consider a single individual hand, the analogy is quite apt. The other way of dividing consciousness is by levels. You see this sometimes in books. They'll lay out the table of consciousness as a grid, and like a table, and so the vertical columns will represent what we've spoken about, the functional, resultant, and effective, and the horizontal columns represent 4 levels. They cut across the other categories. And these levels are sense desire level, kama bhumi, the level of form, the level of formless, and the unconditioned, which is special, separate, but it's given its own categorization here. The sense desire level of consciousness is the most complex and has the most variation within it. And this is the ordinary default consciousness of human beings, as well as lower realms and the sensual devas. So you can see there's a huge range of experiences encompassed within the sense desire realm. Everything from the wretches burning and writhing in the nethermost hell up to the most refined and delicate sensual devas, and everything in between. And what they have in common in all these levels is that they relate to experience primarily through the senses. And here we're mostly talking about the 5 physical senses. That their desires, their fears, their sense impressions, their perceptions, their thoughts, all stem from the senses, which is their relation point to the world. And the senses can be considered as well as a source of information in a functional sense. They're also a prison, they're also a trap, and a source of delusion. They give us a false impression of reality. And we tend to fall into desiring what are considered or classed as pleasant sense experiences, and fear and aversion to unpleasant sense experiences. And those become the carrot and stick that motivate beings to chase around and around in samsara again and again. The Buddha, in one of his teaching parables, used a rather gruesome image to express the nature of sense organs and sense desire. He said, "You've seen, O monks, in this town of Padlaputta, in the marketplace, there's a leper who's always sitting and begging in the marketplace. and his body is covered with weeping sores, and he has beside him a little bronze brazier that he keeps a fire going underneath, red hot coals. And every now and again, with a pair of tongs, he picks up a hot coal from this brazier, and he presses it into one of his weeping sores to cauterize it. And you can smell the burning flesh, and the burns out the pus and corrupted tissue out of the sore. And this gives him a momentary sense of relief. Now, what do you think, bhikkhus? Do you think if that leper could have a miracle and be perfectly cured and healed tomorrow, do you think he would, in the future, and he walked away clean and whole, do you think he would ever feel nostalgia and miss the pleasant sensation of the hot coals burning into his sores? He says that the sores are an image for the sense organs, and the eyes, ears, nose, tongue, and body. And the hot coals are an image for sense objects. And the being in the sense desire realm is always wanting to acquire objects. And it might be for beings who live in this, as we do, in this level of consciousness, it's actually quite difficult to imagine being without, without that way of relating, that way of experiencing the world, that it's such a fundamental part of our psyche at this level of existence. But it is possible to transcend that and to experience the higher levels of consciousness. The next level up is called the Rupa Bhumi, or the Rupa Loka, or Rupa Yatana, the level or world or sphere of form. And it's called that to distinguish it from the next one, which is the formless. And the realm of form is that state of mind that is experienced in jhana, which is meditative absorption, when one has transcended sense experience. By the entry into jhana, the mind has made quiescent the 5 nivarana, or hindrances. And the very fact of the absence of these hindrances, the mind naturally settles into this state, into the jhana state. There's a natural gravity of the mind to settle there when the hindrances are not present. It's these hindrances which keep us entangled in the sense desire level. And they're sense desire itself, and its opposite, ill will or aversion, sloth and torpor, laziness or dullness, anxiety, and skeptical doubt, which are defilements at the kind of cognitive or mental level. And these are the particular states of mind that prevent the mind attaining that unification which occurs with jhana, and keeps one tangled in the maze of the sense desire realm. And the sense desire realm is very much like a maze. It's a constant wandering down strange byways. And it's very complex and bewildering. And the higher you go, the higher your consciousness ascends, the simpler, the more pure, more expansive and open it is. Even within the sense desire realm, there's levels within levels. The experience of a higher level sense dewa is very purified, subtle, and refined relative to ours. But there's still a gap, a gulf between even the most refined sense experience and the experience of the plane of form, the rupa bhumi, which is the mind in jhana, and in terms of a rebirth state of existence, it's Brahma gods. And Brahma gods do not have any of the five hindrances. They're free utterly of sense desire as long as they remain in that Brahma state. They only have the two senses of sight and hearing that are for them merely a purely functional, practical way of seeing and hearing, understanding the world, but they don't desire objects. They don't eat in the ordinary way. Even the dewas, the highest dewas, take divine food, sambhojana, nectar of ambrosia. But the Brahmas are said to feed on bliss. Internally generated bliss is their food. And they don't have sexual relations because they don't have sex. They don't have genders. There are neither male nor female. They're all reckoned just as beings. So they live a very simplified, purified kind of existence. And as you ascend through the levels of the subdivisions of the Rupa Bhumi, you're experiencing a simplification and a purification. And that's the best way to think of advancement in meditation, is simplification and purification. It's not gaining anything, going anywhere. It's removing complications and allowing the mind to experience a more natural state. So the first jhana still has 5 factors. Vitakka vichara, or applied and sustained thought, rapture, bliss, and unification of mind. And the 5 hindrances are absent. And then second jhana loses applied and sustained thought. There's no thinking process occurs in second jhana. So it only has 3 factors. Rapture, which is predominant there, bliss, and unification. And third jhana is bliss and unification only, 2 factors. And fourth jhana, bliss is replaced by equanimity, which transcends bliss and is called the bliss beyond bliss. It's an utter, profound peacefulness. So we can see that the states of mind as one ascends these levels become simpler. There's nothing gained or added. It's just complications and obstructions and obscurations are peeled away. There's a favorite image of in Tibetan Buddhism is the blue sky mind. That the pure, unobstructed mind is like the clear blue sky in a bright day. On a cloudy day, you don't see the blue sky, but it's still there, behind the clouds. But you can't see it. And the clouds are like the obstructions and defilements of the mind. And then when the clouds are blown away, the clear blue sky remains and shines forth again. So we're really just uncovering a more fundamental layer of mind as we ascend. We're not gaining something new. We're allowing the natural state to express itself, to be manifested. The third level of mind is the formless level. which transcends form altogether and is mind in its pure state without reference to body. And that can be experienced as a human being in the formless meditations. The Buddha, when he was searching for enlightenment, before he became enlightened, when he was a bodhisattva wandering and practicing in the forest, he had two teachers that he stayed with briefly for a period of time. And one of them taught the way to nothingness, which is the third level of the formless, and the other one taught neither perception nor non-perception, which is the fourth level. And both of these teachers were convinced that what they had found and experienced and taught was the highest possible ultimate state human beings could attain. And the Buddha attained to these states and realized, no, they still do not transcend becoming. This is not the end of the path. So he had that genius to see that even this most subtle form of samsaric existence is still bound to the processes of coming into being and passing out of being. Still ultimately caught in the cycle of birth and death. So he transcended those by his own efforts and realized the fourth level of consciousness, the state of nibbana, or the unconditioned, where all manifestation ceases. And we often think of these levels of consciousness, and you'll see them represented graphically, as I said, in books, as a vertical hierarchy. But I would suggest another image that may be more fruitful is like a bullseye target, like concentric circles. And if you think of nibbana at the center as the unconditioned, the ultimate state, then around that is the band of the formless consciousness. Then around that is the form level consciousness, and around that is a very wide circle of the sense desire consciousness. So you're moving out from a center successively further away from that place of ultimate cessation, non-manifestation at the center. So that any form of manifestation is essentially a kind of a mistake, a brokenness. It's a movement away from the center. And having consciousness in the formless realm is just like being just barely within samsara. It's the closest possible to nibbana without being there. But there's still a big step to go. But by the time you're way out in the periphery of the sense desire realm, it's so far away as it's completely lost. The consciousness is completely lost in this maze, this wandering of confusion. And in this outer layer, one easily gets caught up in little circles and minor projects and dilemmas and wanderings, whereas they're missing the true goal, which is to move in towards the center. And things can seem so important out here. We get caught up in our own dramas and our own personal crises and neuroses. This is the nature of the sense desire realm and the nature of ego identification. So it's important to see that the crisis of samsara, so to speak, is not a personal one. It's not all about you. There was a Burmese Vipassana teacher who came to America and give some teachings, and at one point one of the senior Western teachers at IMS was in conversation with him, and this little anecdote got into a book. And he asked this Burmese, why is it that in Burma, people go on Vipassana retreats and they have great results very quickly, but there's so many people here in America that do retreat after retreat and struggle and work, and they don't get anywhere. And this Burmese master said that from his observation, he says, most Americans, and I think we could generalize that to most Westerners, he said most Americans, they don't do Vipassana at all. They're doing self-psychoanalysis. Meaning that they're caught in their own ego struggles. So this was in an article by Jack Engler. He was the Western teacher who wrote this, and his comment on that was also, I thought, very good. He said that Vipassana should be about process, not content. So you have images related to memory arising in the mind. The psychoanalytic tendency would be then to try and decipher these images and what they mean for your personality, and what happened in my childhood that would cause me to have this and that quirk and so on. Whereas the Vipassana approach is to try and understand the process of memory and of imaging. And the only relevance to your personal story is it's the only case study you've got to work with. But it's not in itself anything special or important. But what's important to look at is the process of thinking, the process. How does that work? How does the process of memory work? How does the process of feeling happy or sad or whatever, work? And to see that process in an impersonal way. And that's how we can begin to untangle the tangled knots of the sense desire realm, not to tie ourselves further up by validating and giving importance and reality to the formations at this level, but seeing through them and trying to get clear of them. I think from a totally different tradition and source, the story of the Gordian knot. The Gordian knot was a very twisted, complicated knot that was tied up in somewhere in Asia Minor, and generations of wise men had tried to unravel the knot, and nobody could do it. Every time they pulled on a piece, it would just tighten some other piece, and it became like this sort of ongoing puzzle to try and undo the knot, until Alexander the Great came along and they showed him the knot, and he just, oh, that's easy. He took out his sword and cut it in half. And that's the image of the sword of the crystal clear mind in Vipassana, cutting through the knot, not trying to unravel it, but cutting through it, seeing its essentially empty nature.
Andamayam Kamakataya Sadhu Kalam Salamase Sadhu Sadhu Sadhu